Much for joining us today for our talk on the Yemeni economy with Charles Schmitz, who will be examining the transition in Yemen from an oil-dependent economy to a more diversified one. He's written about this topic in a policy brief, which we had the pleasure of publishing just last month. I hope everybody got a copy of it. If not, we can print out more. We'll be examining his findings today. In the introduction, he notes that Yemen's economy, as we all know, is extremely fragile and has been suffering from the conflict that has been taking place. But he spells out ways he believes this water-dependent nation can start to diversify and build capacities in other ways. We'll be talking about this for about 20 to 30 minutes, but because politics and the economy are so linked, I hope we'll also have a chance to talk about the evolving political situation in Yemen, which continues to defy expectations with its many plot twists and turns. I gather as we speak, the president is on his way to the United States for medical treatment, but is planning his return. If we don't get a chance to talk about it in the presentation, hopefully in the Q&A. If you know this remarkable and complex country as well as Charles, who's an associate professor of geography at Towson University and the president of the American Institute for Yemeni Studies, which is the only American academic institute that is active on the Arabian Peninsula. He began his interest in Yemen, being a Fulbright scholar in Yemen in the early 90s, and his research on Yemen covers many bases, from the political economy of development there to their counter-terror policy. He's also been involved in the defense of several Yemeni detainees in Guantanamo, which I wanted to mention because it's such a fascinating part of what he's done. Very prominently, he was involved in the case of Salim Hamdan, who won the Supreme Court case Hamdan versus Rumsfeld in 2005. He served as the translator and consultant on that case. So it's a real pleasure to have him here with us today. Please join me in welcoming Charles Schmitz.
Thank you. Let me just hit the highlights of this paper because I think that the economy is something that a lot of people have talked about. It's underlying a lot of people's concern about Yemen, but I haven't seen a whole lot of informed conversation about the possibilities of a future Yemeni economy. And so that's what I try and do here. I try and take kind of the broad questions that are confronting Yemen. And the first thing I do is try and locate Yemen, the Yemen state, try and identify the Yemeni economy in the spectrum of economies across the world, because we always hear that Yemen is extremely poor. Well, yeah, that's relative. It's true that within the Arab world, and particularly on the Arabian Peninsula, Yemen is very poor. But Yemen's economy is actually at the top end of sub-Saharan African countries. If you look at the GDP per capita of Yemen, let's say it's about 1,000 and falling a little bit, but it's around $1,000. The GDP per capita of India is 1,200. So, just a little bit of perspective. Also, the poverty levels, which we know are high in Yemen. It's on the headcount basis, it's about 42%, and it's probably a little bit higher today. Most of sub-Saharan Africa has much higher poverty levels than that. It's not uncommon to find in a sub-Saharan African country 60% of people living under the poverty lines. This is the UNDP's poverty lines. And the other thing is that, I remember I used to work construction, and when somebody got fired, every mistake that happens on the job belongs to that guy. And after a while, the boss goes, that guy was awful busy, And that's kind of the case also, I think, with the last 20 years. A lot's going to be blamed on Ali Abdullah Saleh, but actually there's been a lot of achievements that we have to recognize. If you look at their HDI, their Human Development Index, it's been rising over the last 20 years. GDP per capita has been rising in spite of the very rapid population growth. I sort of describe, I think I say it in the paper here, that Yemen has been making slight headway, trading water against a strong current population growth, which is actually a pretty good achievement. Education has been going up. If you look at the literacy rates, particularly among 15 to 24, it's pretty good. Again, people bemoan the education in Yemen. There's plenty to bemoan there. But I think you have to look kind of clearly at what the situation is and recognize that there have been significant achievements in the last 20 years. Okay, so then, what's to worry about? Well, I would say that, and we have to recognize this, that there are two sort of aspects to the current crises. Okay, one is a short term, and another is a long term. The short term has to do with the political crisis. It has to do with the blowing up of the oil pipes. It has to do with the deterioration of security. It has to do with the dysfunction in institutions. These are all short term crises that have exacerbated Yemen's economy. One thing that we should say about that, if you look at when Yemen's political crises broke out, take the Houthis or take the secessionist movement in the south, it happens actually when Yemen is richest. It happens when the oil revenues are highest in Yemen. So to say that it's a dire situation or extreme poverty that's driving the crisis, it's simply not true. It was really politics that were driving those crises, So now you have a situation where the Yemeni economy is facing a transition, and that's the more longer term. We'll call it a medium term crisis that the Yemeni economy is facing. If you look at the modern Yemeni economy, there have been two phases. The first phase happened sort of at the settlement of the North Yemeni Civil War, 1970. 1973, you had the oil boom in the Arabian Peninsula and a massive expansion of infrastructure in the Arabian Peninsula. And Yemenis basically got up and went and did all that. Yemenis contributed significantly to the building of Saudi Arabia, and southern Yemenis to Kuwait and the Emirates and those areas. The remittances that were sent home from all that labor, it was about 3/4 of the Yemeni labor force that left. I mean, that's incredible. 3/4 of the country's labor force just gets up and goes. And they sent back money, and that transformed the economy from sort of a subsistence agricultural economy to one that was based on worker remittances, and everybody at home. The economy has transformed into a massive sort of commercial network for importing consumer goods. So everybody was buying cars, everybody was buying refrigerators, VCRs, and all this kind of stuff. And the government kind of played catch-up. But the government at that point, they weren't driving that at all. It was driven by these worker remittances, which they had no control over. And so the government was, through its local development agencies, it was trying to capture some of that and get it to invest in basic infrastructure. And so, just as an example, I remember meeting a guy out in Marib, which is, out in the desert out there. And it was kind of in the evening, he was standing by his truck, his Toyota truck, and the Toyota truck was running, but he was just standing there. And I was going, "What are you running? You're going to run out of gas." He says, "Oh, no, you don't understand." And he says, I'm not running this for the truck. I'm running this to charge the battery. Why are you charging the battery? Oh, to run the VCR. He had a couple of them, and he would charge them up, and then he'd go. And that was Yemen in that era when there was massive remittances coming in, all of this importation of consumer goods, but there was no infrastructure to run it. The infrastructure took some time to catch up with it. That began to collapse in the mid '80s. Went for a couple of reasons. One, the Gulf economy started to mature. They didn't need so much of the low-skilled labor, construction labor. And the other reason was that their economies actually, there was a fall in oil prices, and so there wasn't so much spent on the construction. And Yemenis began to come home. And 1990, we all say, is the end of the remittance economy when the Saudis sort of closed the door on the special status of the Yemenis in Saudi Arabia and sort of dumped 800,000 Yemenis over the border in a matter of weeks. But what's interesting is that in terms of absolute figures, the remittances have actually remained stable and have slightly increased. It always was about $1.2 billion in remittances, and I think this year it's up a little bit more. I think it was up to almost to $2 billion. But